Okay, guys, so let's proceed analyzing the Keynesian model. So last time we just introduced the background material in terms of why we really need to start the Keynesian model. The main story, it's all about why does expenditure and income divert from equilibrium. Okay, remember we said that along this 45-degree line, expenditure is always equal to income. So we really want to understand why in reality the economy moves in cycles rather than on a straight path. And we looked at the different economic models that we said they are used to, or they're an attempt to explain business cycles, okay? And remember what business cycles are. Business cycles basically refers to deviations of income and expenditure from equilibrium. One of the key models that we discussed briefly is Say's law. And if you still remember, we say Say's law is a supply-driven model, meaning that the model basically postulates that production it's one which, in other words, it postulates that expenditure is a function of production, meaning to say whenever there's goods and services that have been produced, then there's always going to be an expenditure. And we did discuss what were the main challenges or what led to the downfall of the Say's law, basically due to the Great Depression in the 1930s, whereby production was quite very high, but expenditure was low. And as a result, I've got a term saying poverty amongst the plenty, because there was a lot of goods and services, but expenditure didn't catch up with the level of production. Okay, so the next model that we're going to look at today is the Keynesian model. So this is really the model that you are going to be tested on in macroeconomics in this model. Yes, of course, you really need to understand something about Say's law. That okay, Say's law is a supply-driven model, but the model that you really need to make sure that you understand in and out is the Keynesian model. And we are going to develop or analyze this model step by step without really leaving any stone unturned. Okay, so the central idea of the Keynesian model is that output or production, and therefore income, is driven by, or it depends on, aggregate spending rather or aggregate demand rather than what Say's law is saying. So you can see the Keynesian model basically is moving from the opposite direction. The opposite direction from which this Say's law is coming from. Okay, Say's law is saying that first of all, you've got production and then you've got demand. But on the other hand, the Keynesian model is actually saying, first of all, there has to be demand before production. Okay, so the Keynesian model is basically a demand-driven model, meaning first of all, there is aggregate demand. There has to be an aggregate demand for goods and services. And this aggregate demand for goods and services is actually the one which is going to determine how much goods and services are going to be produced. Okay, contrast this with the Say's law. Say's law says that first of all, begin with production, and then once goods and services have been produced, there's always going to be a demand for goods and services. But that was not the case in the 1930s. But according to the Keynesian model, it says no, that's not the right way or the right approach of looking at things. You have to look at the relationship between production and expenditure from the aggregate or from the expenditure side. And I think this is sort of similar to what happens nowadays, because when you look at businesses, how businesses actually operate nowadays, before you produce anything, you write a business plan. You look at whether there's a market or there's a demand for whatever you are trying to sell. You don't just sell, you don't just produce any product and then hope that there's always going to be demand, but you do market research, you establish that there's always demand. So once there's demand, then that demand is going to drive production. And it's actually going to give you an indication in terms of what's your production level supposed to be. Okay, so in the Keynesian model, so first of all, there's demand, that is the consumption of goods and services. And then once there's the demand for goods and services, then this is going to lead to supply. And therefore production, which is supply, is really a function of expenditure, meaning to say production, the production of goods and services, and therefore income, it also depends, production is a function of expenditure, meaning to say production and income are a function of expenditure, or they depend on demand. So really expenditure is all about demand. Okay, when you're spending on something, it simply means that you add money. So we can contrast this simple framework with what Say's law says. So Say's law, income influences aggregate expenditure, so aggregate demand, meaning to say that the relationship runs from income to aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand. So A here is always going to remain referred to aggregate expenditure or aggregate demand, and then Y it's always for income. And but remember, income is always equal to production. That's what Say's law says, and therefore there is no need for government intervention on aggregate demand, because I mean, why are you going to intervene on aggregate demand when sort of aggregate demand depends on income? Probably, maybe the case for government intervention with regard to Say's law is say that, okay, maybe the government can actually intervene on the supply side of the economy rather than on the demand side of the economy. But I mean, when you intervene as a government, for instance, like what happened in the 1930s, if you intervene on the supply side and you encourage businesses to produce more goods and services without really boosting demand, there's always going to be a lot of goods and services, but demand is always going to remain low, as what happened in the 1930s. Okay, so but that's what Say's law says. On the other hand, the Keynesian model, or Keynes, okay, by the way, the Keynesian model is due to this guy called John Maynard Keynes. Okay, John Maynard Keynes. So this is one of the most prominent economists in the use of economics. He was a British economist, a really brilliant economist and mathematicians. If you can read in terms of, if you really want to read about him, you can Google Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and you can find a lot of information regarding this gentleman. But yeah, he was a British economist, a really brilliant one. So this Keynesian model is really attributed to John Maynard Keynes, okay, because he's the sort of the founding father of Keynesian economics. Okay, so the Keynesian economics simply says that aggregate spending or demand influences income. So the relationship really runs from, first of all, from aggregate demand, and then aggregate demand is going to determine the production of goods and services, or the income also, which is going to be earned from those goods and services, or the factors of production. Okay, and therefore the government can really intervene or can influence income or production through actions or policies that increase or decrease aggregate demand. So if you know that income depends on aggregate demand, okay, so if you want to increase income, what are you going to do? Just simply increase production, aggregate demand. Okay, so if you want to influence income to increase, and you know that income depends on aggregate demand, you can simply intervene on aggregate demand to increase. Once aggregate demand increases, we know that because income depends on aggregate demand, and then also income is also going to increase. So the Keynesian model, or Keynesian economics, really laid the foundation for government intervention, that is fiscal policy. Okay, so if you really do not like government intervention in the economy, we're going to discuss how can the government really intervene in the economy to influence aggregate demand, which automatically, or which is also going to lead to an increase in aggregate production or income. But for now, we're saying this is the model which really proposes government intervention in the economy, okay? Because the Keynesian model looks and say that, okay, but production is so high in the 1930s, yet aggregate demand, it's very low. Therefore, if we really want to increase to make sure that aggregate demand matches up with income, we can also intervene on the aggregate demand side to make sure that the economy is going to be in equilibrium. But that's the background material regarding the Keynesian model. But that's really the model which we're going to be discussing it in more detail right now. So let's look at aggregate demand. What really is aggregate demand? Because we're saying aggregate demand is what determines production in the country. Okay, that's what determines income. We don't really care about income itself. We don't really care about the value of GDP, which is production. But we really want to understand and analyze what really determines the level of GDP. And according to the Keynesian model, it is aggregate demand. And therefore, we have to make sure that we really understand what is aggregate demand. Because once we understand aggregate demand, and then we're going to understand how GDP is influenced or determines. In other words, we're going to understand why in 2021, when aggregate demand was low, also GDP growth was low. Okay, in 2022, things are looking a little bit rosy. People are happy. Production is expanding. People are also going on holidays. And therefore, we'll be able to say, okay, we think GDP is rising this year because aggregate demand is also rising. And therefore, the key thing that we really need to make sure that we unpack is aggregate demand, okay? And we're then going to tie aggregate demand to production, of course, okay? So aggregate demand refers to the spending on all goods and services produced in an economy. So aggregate demand is as simple as the spending, okay? Spending on all goods and services in an economy. So we're not just looking at spending on just one product, but we're looking at all goods and services in an economy, okay? So we're adding all spending that takes place in an economy on all goods and services produced in that particular year. That's aggregate, that aggregate demand. So when you look at the spending that happens or that takes place on all goods and services produced in a particular country, okay, we can actually identify 4 main components of aggregate demand. In other words, let's say South Africa produced goods worth 200 billion, okay, in 2020, and those goods were actually purchased, all of them, okay? All of these goods worth 200 billion were purchased in 2020. So we are saying we can actually identify 4 main sources of expenditure, okay? That is 1, 2, 3, and 4. And those 4 main sources of expenditure are known as the components of aggregate demand. In other words, which sector or which component or who purchased what out of this 200 billion worth of goods and services produced in 2022. Okay, so there are 4 main components of aggregate demand. Firstly, we've got consumption spending. Secondly, we've got investment spending. Third, we've got government spending. And fourth, we've got exports, less imports. And this one is known as net exports. In other words, the difference between exports and imports, or exports minus imports, is known as net exports. So we are saying, if you look at all goods and services that were produced in South Africa in 2022, some of those goods are going to be consumed by households. In other words, the consumers, just like ourselves, okay? Myself and yourself. And some of those goods were purchased by businesses, okay? And the spending by businesses is really known as investment spending, okay? So consumption spending is simply saying that this represents, even though we're going to unpack everything in more detail, but just to give you a quick definition, a quick peek through into what these components of aggregate spending really represent. Consumption spending refers to just in the spending by household or individuals on goods and services that they need to satisfy their needs. So this is just final consumption spend. That is, you're not purchasing something for the purpose of reselling. No, you are purchasing something to consume, to satisfy your needs or your wants. That's why it's known as final consumption spending, because that product has actually reached its final stage. It can be transformed, it can be sold further, it needs to be consumed. Okay, we were going to look at household consumption spending further, but if we just take the portion of consumption spending by household, we can identify some of goods and services being purchased by businesses, okay? But businesses, they do not consume goods and services, okay? We know that they produce goods and services, and in order to produce goods and services, they're gonna have to invest, okay? You invest in capacity, you invest in research and development. So the spending or the aggregate demand made by businesses is really known as investment spending. And when you take investment spending plus consumption spending, these two, they are known as private spending. So when you hear someone speak of private spending, just know that they're referring to household consumption spending and business investment spending. These two are known as private spending. And sometimes when you're looking at national statistics, you might find that the way things are categorized, there's going to be a distinction between private spending as well as public spending, okay? But now when you take private spending and we add government spending, really government spending, we're looking at national government, provincial government, as well as local municipalities. So any spending on goods and services by anything that is classified as business, as the government, it falls under government spending. And we know that the government does spend on a lot of things such as infrastructure, education, healthcare, public goods, and so forth. Okay, so everything that the government purchases is really going to be part of government spending. So if we add private spending, which is consumption spending plus investment spending, we're then going to have, we add it to government spending, we're going to have what is known as public spending. But if you're just looking at private spending, okay, so we're just looking at the household. We're just with consumption spending, we're just looking at households that are located within a country. In other words, households that are in South Africa. Okay, investment spending, we're also looking at spending by businesses that are located in South Africa. So that's why this is domestic private spending. In other words, that's how we can call it, because we're not looking at the spending on goods and services that were produced in South Africa by non-South African residents. In other words, by households that are not in South Africa. We're simply looking at households that are within South Africa. So if we add private spending plus public spending, we've got what is known as domestic spending. Okay, so domestic spending, it is private spending plus public spending. What is private spending? It is consumption spending by household plus investment spending by businesses. But we know that when you produce goods and services in a country, not all those goods and services are actually going to be consumed in the country. Some of the goods and services are exported or sold to other countries. And those goods and services that are sold to other countries are known as exports. Okay, so we produce something in South Africa, but that we produce is not going to be consumed entirely in South Africa. Some of it is going to be sold to other countries. Okay, whether it's going to be sold to household or to businesses or to governments of other countries, it doesn't really matter. As long as it was produced in South Africa and then sold to other countries, it is part of exports. But exports are really a component of domestic spending. They represent spending on goods and services that were produced within the country. Okay, but when you look at the goods and services that we really are consuming as well in South Africa, not everything that we are consuming was produced domestically. Some of the goods and services were really imported from or were produced in other countries. For instance, right now I've got a lot of computers on my in front of me here. I've got computers, I've got microphones, I've got printers, and when I look at these ones, I can see my printer simply say that designed in Japan. Okay, so that is not part of goods and services produced in South Africa, but the consumption of that product is actually taking place or happening in South Africa. Okay, so when you're looking at aggregate demand, we're simply looking at the spending on goods and services that were domestically produced. So we have to make sure that we add those goods and services that were produced in South Africa but consumed in other countries. But we also have to separate goods and services that were consumed in South Africa but were not produced outside of South Africa, because the production that we really want to understand, ladies and gentlemen, it is the production that is taking place in South Africa. We really want to understand what determines production in South Africa or what determines income in South Africa. And if we are saying income or production depends on aggregate demand, it simply means that we just need to look at the demand for goods and services, those goods and services that were domestically produced. So exports less imports, it represent what is known as external spending. So external spending, that is spending by residents of other countries on goods and services domestically produced, minus the spending by domestic residents on goods and services that were produced in other countries. So if we take domestic spending and we add some external spending, we've got aggregate demand. So the Keynesian model really says that, okay, aggregate demand is identical to or is equal to consumption spending plus investment spending, which is private spending, or domestic private spending, plus government, which is really public spending. So if we add government spending plus investment spending plus consumption spending, we've got domestic spending. And then we add external spending, that is exports minus imports. And then we've got the aggregate demand. So the Keynesian model really, it's all about understanding, okay, what determines consumption spending. Okay, why would consumption spending be high in a certain period and below in another period? Why would investment spending be high in one period and below in another period? And about why the government spending might rise and then decrease in one period as compared to another period. That's what the Keynesian model really tried to give us. So, okay, we know aggregate demand, these ones, they influence production. But if you really want to understand how aggregate demand influences production, look at the components of aggregate demand itself. What determines consumption spending? Why households sometimes they spend a lot on goods and services, but they spend less in some years. Okay, why do businesses invest a lot? Because we know that when businesses are investing a lot, it means aggregate demand is actually going to increase. And if aggregate demand is increasing, from the Keynesian model, from what we've just learned right now, we know that production or income is also going to really increase. So the Keynesian model is all about analyzing the components of aggregate demand and just look at what determines or what influences or on what variables does consumption depends on what variables does investment depend on, what variables influences government spending, and what variables influences exports, and what variables influences imports. So if you know those variables, and then we're going to know, okay, this is how, for instance, let's say that household consumption spending depends on maybe expectations about the future. If households are becoming more confident about the future, that is, okay, things are really good. They don't expect emergencies. They don't expect coronavirus to last forever. And then they know that, okay, things are really going to be good. It means that they're going to start spending more because they know that their job security is guaranteed. Okay, if they spend more, it simply means that aggregate demand is also going to increase. And we know that when aggregate demand increases, then income, according to the Keynesian model, income or production are supposed to increase as well. Okay, so we're going to have to look at determinants of aggregate demand. But first of all, we're just going to look at the determinants of aggregate demand in what is known as a closed economy. Okay, what is a closed economy? So a closed economy is really one which does not trade with the outside world. Okay, in other words, in a closed economy, we don't have external spending. So we are actually just assuming that in a closed economy, the country is consuming everything that was produced domestically. And at the same time, that country is not selling anything to the outside world. The country is not selling anything to the outside world, meaning exports are zero. And at the same time, the country is not consuming anything from the outside world, meaning imports are also equal to zero. And that's known as a closed economy, and a country which does not have any economic relationship with other countries. Okay, so what is and therefore both exports and imports are equal to zero. We don't have this component in a closed economy. You really need to understand what really a closed economy, because they do like asking about the closed economy. What is a closed economy? Sometimes they say in a closed economy, exports are equal to, okay, so you just need to know that exports are equal to zero because the country does not have any economic relationship with the outside world. Okay, so what are the determinants of aggregate demand in a closed economy? So we just need to look at the aggregate demand model, and then we just slash out exports minus imports. So we're just looking at just domestic spending without exports and imports. Okay, so this is aggregate demand in a closed economy. It has got three components. It has got consumption spending, it has got investment spending, it has got government spending. So this economy is closed because it just deals with itself. Okay, it just deals with itself. It doesn't deal with the outside world. As a result, in a closed economy, aggregate demand is equal to consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending. Okay, so we first of all going to look at the Keynesian model in a closed economy. In other words, we're going to look at what is known as the simple Keynesian model. So in addition to studying a closed economy, we first of all going to look at what is known as this simple Keynesian model of aggregate demand. Okay, so I said this aggregate demand basically represents the economy, what is happening within an economy. Okay, so in a simple Keynesian model, but remember, we're also looking at the closed economy. Okay, but this closed economy, it's also the simplest economy. And we're saying that in a simple Keynesian model, in this simple economy, there is no government and foreign sector. The economy is closed, there's no foreign sector. But it is even much more simpler because we're saying that there is no government. And we'll simply say that, therefore, as a result, the only economic decision makers that we have in that closed economy, it's really just household and businesses. Okay, so these are the only components of aggregate demand in this simple Keynesian model. Later on, we're going to look at the full Keynesian model, where we also have the government as well as the foreign sector. And then we're going to see, okay, how does the economy look like, and how does aggregate demand operate in relation to production or income in the full Keynesian model. But in this model, the simple Keynesian model, so whenever you hear the word simple Keynesian model, just know that we don't have the government. We also don't have the foreign sector. So we're just going to look at things from the simplest perspective, and then we're gonna develop or expand on our understanding by looking at even more intricate scenarios. Okay, so in a simple Keynesian model, aggregate demand A. Okay, so sometimes you might find me I just write A, sometimes I write AD. Okay, just know that I'm referring to the same thing, and this AD, it's really the spending, that is spending on goods and services that we produce within a country. So if we don't have any government, and we also don't have any foreign sector, it simply means that the spending that is going to take place in a country, it is going to be by household or by businesses. That's why we are saying in a simple Keynesian model, aggregate demand is really equal to consumption spending by household plus investment spending. Okay, so where aggregate A is for aggregate demand, and C is for household consumption spending, and then I is for businesses. So that's what we're going to be doing from this point onwards. We're just going to be dealing with what determines consumption spending. We want to look at in more detail, because we know that whatever determines consumption spending, it is going to determine aggregate demand, and whatever determines aggregate demand, it is going to determine income or production, which is really what we really want to understand. So, okay, why does aggregate demand, or why does spending and income deviate from equilibrium? Okay, and the model is simply saying that you have to look at aggregate demand. So to really understand the aggregate demand, you have to make sure that you unpack it in its further components. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing from this point on. So we first of all going to look at consumption spending. So we're going to look at consumption spending in more detail and look at what is the relationship between consumption spending and income, and also what are the determinants of consumption spending. Once that is done, we're then going to move on to investment spending. What is the relationship between investment spending and income? And at the same time, how does investment spending really affect aggregate demand, and what are the determinants of investment spending? And then once we're done with everything there, we're just going to look at the full Keynesian model, which has got the government as well as the foreign sector. But otherwise, this is the background. Okay, so if we really understand the simple Keynesian model, adding the government and the foreign sector, it's really just going to be a breeze. Okay, so let's meet again and look at the household consumption spending. In other words, the components of aggregate demand in a simple Keynesian model for a closed economy. Okay, let's meet again. Thank you.